I've hiked enough winters to know the difference between fear and caution. Fear is loud. It panics. It invents threats where none exist. Caution is quiet. It notices patterns. My friend Lucas and I were cautious people. We chose the route deliberately, an overlooked mountain corridor far from popular trails, buried under snow for most of the year. We wanted isolation, the kind that clears your head. Both of us had years of cold weather hiking behind us. We logged routes, marked weather changes, carried redundant gear. Nothing about this trip was reckless. The first day passed cleanly. Hard ground, biting air, no wind. We made camp just before dusk along a ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley choked with spruce. The quiet felt earned. That night, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Not heavy. Not rushing. Slow compressions in the snow, evenly spaced. They moved around the tent once, then stopped. I waited for an animal's snort, a shuffle, something organic. Nothing followed. When I finally unzipped the tent, the snow outside was smooth. No prints, no scuffing, no indication anything had been there at all. Lucas hadn't heard it. That bothered me more than if he had. The next day, we noticed the trail felt altered. Subtle changes. Our map showed a shallow bend that no longer existed. Trees leaned in unfamiliar ways, branches snapped clean at chest height. Once, I found a line carved into bark, straight, precise, too deliberate to be damage. Lucas said it was probably old survey work. I didn't argue, but I started marking our position more frequently. By afternoon, we reached a clearing that felt wrong the moment we stepped into it. The trees formed a loose circle, evenly spaced, all the same height. The snow inside the ring was thinner, compacted, as if it had been disturbed and reset. The air was completely still. Lucas took a photo. Later, when we reviewed it, the center of the image was warped, not blurred, not obscured, just subtly distorted, like depth itself had folded inward. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't circle. They paced. Back and forth along the edge of our firelight, never crossing into it, never retreating. When Lucas flicked his headlamp toward the sound, it stopped instantly, as if motion itself depended on being unseen. We didn't sleep. Caution had become something else. By the third morning, neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew we were no longer navigating freely. It felt like our choices were narrowing without explanation. Our route narrowed despite the map promising wider ground. Snowfall erased our older tracks, but new ones appeared where either of us remembered stepping. At one point, Lucas stopped abruptly and pointed behind us. Someone had walked the trail backward. Not crossed it. Not followed alongside. The prints retreated directly opposite our direction, perfectly aligned, like a mirrored exit. We didn't turn around. We should have. That evening, we camped early in a shallow gully where the trees pressed close. The space felt compressed, the darkness heavier. As Lucas reorganized his pack, I stepped a few yards away to check the tree line. That's when I saw it. Something crouched near our gear. It wasn't rifling through anything. It wasn't hiding. It simply occupied the space, hunched low, arms longer than they should have been, posture folded inward like it was conserving itself. I called out. It reacted slowly, not startled, not aggressive. It rose in sections, joints straightening in the wrong order. It turned without facing me and walked into the trees. When Lucas reached me, there was nothing there. No tracks. No compressed snow. No sign anything had ever stood beside our camp. We didn't sleep that night. Sometime before dawn, I saw it again, standing just beyond the fire's reach. Not watching us. Watching the space around us. Like we were variables in something being measured. The fire popped. It vanished. We packed without speaking and left before sunrise, abandoning the route, ignoring the map. The terrain grew increasingly difficult to navigate. Paths narrowed, slopes steepened, but eventually the terrain finally opened enough for us to escape. We reached the car by late afternoon. Weeks later, I checked satellite maps of the area. The clearing doesn't exist. The route doesn't exist. And sometimes, when I hike familiar trails now, I notice footprints behind me that match my stride perfectly, except they stop when I turn around. Caution still whispers. Fear never needed to. I didn't go into the mountains looking for answers. I went because I needed quiet. Winter had already swallowed most of the range when I parked my truck at the end of an unmaintained forestry road. Snow pressed against the doors, the sky hung low and gray, and the forest felt older than it should have, like it had been waiting. I carried two things with me: my camping gear and a weather notebook I'd bought weeks earlier from a roadside antique stall in a rural town I don't remember the name of. The man who sold it to me warned me not to read it alone. I laughed and paid him anyway. The notebook belonged to someone named Evan Holt, dated nearly 30 years back. He'd been documenting survey work in these same mountains. His entries weren't poetic, mostly coordinates, weather notes, sketches of terrain. But scattered between them were stranger observations, repeated mentions of spacing, notes about lights moving between trees, and a symbol drawn again and again in the margins, always slightly different, like it was being copied from memory instead of sight. I set my tent near a tree line overlooking a frozen ravine. The wind carved thin lines through the snow, erasing tracks almost as soon as they formed. As daylight faded, the silence thickened. No birds. No distant engines. Just the sound of my breath and the slow settling of the forest. That night, I read the notebook by lantern light. One entry stopped me cold. Something watches from the high ground. It doesn't approach. It records. I laughed it off, zipped my jacket tighter, and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of crunching snow. Not random. Measured. Slow. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped just beyond the tent wall. I waited for more, breathing, movement, anything. Nothing came. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent, the snow outside was smooth and untouched. No footprints. No drag marks. No sign I'd heard anything at all. In the morning, I found something worse. About 20 feet from my camp were thin wooden stakes pushed into the snow, forming a wide circle around the tent. Each was spaced evenly, precise enough to feel intentional. I hadn't seen them the night before. I checked the notebook again. Evan had drawn the same circle. The second night was colder. The kind of cold that feels deliberate. I moved my camp closer to the ravine, hoping the wind would mask whatever sounds had woken me before. That was a mistake. The ravine carried noise. Every scrape, every shift of ice echoed upward, distorting distance and direction. Before sunset, I explored further downslope and found a collapsed shelter half buried in snow. Inside were scraps of paper, brittle and stained. Notes. Diagrams. All written in the same hand as the notebook. Evan Holt hadn't just passed through, he'd stayed. One page listed dates. Next to each was a single word, observed. The last date was circled repeatedly. That night, I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't circling. It was above me. Something shifting position along the ridge, snow sliding softly downhill. My lantern flickered, not out, just enough to make shadows move wrong. Then came the sound I can't explain. Paper rustling. It was outside the tent. Slow. Careful. Like someone turning pages. I reached for the zipper, and froze. A shadow passed across the tent wall. Tall. Too thin. It paused, then something pressed lightly against the fabric, testing. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. A notebook dropped into the snow beside my tent. When morning came, I packed in silence. The notebook outside wasn't mine, but the handwriting matched perfectly. The final entry read: Subject reacts to placement. Observation complete. I never went back. Search teams later asked me questions about missing hikers, about markers found deep in the range, about documents no one could trace. I didn't tell them everything. Some nights, when it's quiet, I swear I can hear pages turning outside my window. And I know I'm still being recorded. I've always gone camping alone in winter. Something about the cold, the quiet, and the way the woods feel stripped of distractions makes it feel like the world belongs only to you. That January, I decided to explore a narrow hollow near a ridge deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The hollow was shielded on three sides by slopes and thick stands of pine, giving me a sense of complete isolation. I had studied the topo maps for weeks and planned every step: water sources, slopes, potential campsites. Everything about this trip was calculated, routine even, for someone like me who had logged countless winter miles. The first night was perfect in a way that winter nights can be. The snow underfoot was crisp, the creek nearby was frozen solid, and the air was so still it felt almost alive. I'd boiled snow in a tin pot, made a weak tea, and sat by my small fire until the flames dwindled and my fingers grew stiff. The silence wasn't empty. It felt like the forest itself was watching, breathing quietly around me. I loved that feeling. I crawled into my tent and buried myself in my sleeping bag, listening to the cold hum of wind through the trees. The next morning, I decided to climb the eastern ridge for a better view of the valley. My thighs burned with exertion, but the sight from the top was worth it: rolling ridges, frosted trees, and miles of untouched snow. Then I saw it. A black, vertical shape rising above the far western ridge. At first, I thought it was a tree, maybe a burnt one. But it didn't sway. It didn't lean. Its lines were unnaturally straight, too narrow to be a tree, too tall to be human. For a moment I convinced myself it was a trick of light or fatigue, something my mind had imposed on the landscape. I stayed for a few minutes, eyes locked on the silhouette, but it didn't change. Eventually, I turned back and returned to my campsite, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had begun to settle in my chest. Night fell, and something about the hollow felt different. Not louder, not crowded, just heavier. As I zipped into my sleeping bag, I felt a vibration in my teeth, like a dull hum deep inside my skull. It was subtle at first, but it grew steadily, pulsing, like it was scanning. I unzipped the tent carefully and peered out. The snow was untouched. The creek frozen. The trees rigid and still. But the black shape from the ridge was closer now, unmistakably perched above a boulder halfway down the slope. It hadn't moved naturally, it had simply appeared there. My breath caught, and I felt every instinct in my body scream to move, to flee. I didn't. I just watched, frozen, as the thing remained perfectly upright, perfectly still, silently observing. I didn't sleep. Not a wink. I gripped the tent zipper with both hands, my body stiff, my ears straining for the slightest sound. The vibration pulsed in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. Every shadow felt like it was shifting on its own. By dawn, the ridge was empty, the snow pristine. No tracks, no indication that anything had ever been there. I packed silently, double-checked my gear, and took a longer, more circuitous route out of the hollow, hugging lower ridges, keeping my eyes glued to every contour of the woods. The hours crawled by. I felt watched even when I couldn't see anything. Branches snapped faintly behind me, too clean, too deliberate to be random. Rocks were stacked along the trail in small, geometric piles, the kind no one casually makes. I tried to convince myself it was natural occurrences, maybe wind or wildlife, but the unease had dug too deep. Something had been there, and it wasn't human. By mid-afternoon, I finally emerged onto a familiar trail that led back to my truck. The relief I felt was immediate, physical, almost tangible. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't take photos. I didn't even allow myself to breathe deeply until I was in the car, heating up leftover soup and warming my frozen fingers. The experience left me shaken in ways I couldn't explain, but I told myself it was an anomaly, a hallucination brought on by cold, isolation, and exhaustion. Years later, I got an unexpected email from someone named Jared. He ran an online hiking forum I used to post on, and he mentioned that he and his son had camped near the same hollow. He asked if I'd ever seen a tall, black column on the western ridge. A totem, as his son had described it. He sent a grainy photo. I recognized it instantly. Same shape. Same unnatural presence. They had seen it overnight, Just as I had, and it had vanished by morning, leaving nothing behind. Jared said it gave them both a strange, nauseating sensation just by looking at it. I haven't returned to that hollow. I haven't camped alone in winter since. Even now, years later, I avoid the ridge whenever I'm in the area. That thing wasn't human, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't stationary. It watched, it waited, and it moved in ways that defy understanding. The forest may seem empty, the snow untouched, but I know better. Some things in the mountains don't belong to the living, and they never stop observing.